much. I've only got 10 minutes in which to explain how drones are not changing the face of war, but they're part of the change in the face of war. And the chair asked me just before we came in here whether I was in favor of drones or not, and I said I was resigned to the use of drones because I am resigned to this change in the face of war. I don't think there's much point being for or against it, and this is the very first observation I want to make. I'm going to make 5 very quick ones. Practically every technology from the early 20th century on, the inventors of those technologies said that they would make war impossible. Orville Wright said 13 years after he took flight that planes would make war impossible. Marconi, the inventor of radio, said that radio would make war wicked, which is a slight variation on Oscar Wilde's idea that once war ceased to be wicked and became vulgar, it would come to an end. I think he still was onto something there. The third was Hiram Maxim, the inventor of the machine gun, who said that it would make war so wicked that it would not come to an end. Fascinating thing is that no one has said that the invention of drones is likely to bring war to an end. 76 countries are now investing in drone technology. Not all of this, the killer drones, not all of them predator drones, for example, of the next generation. Only 15 countries are inventing in cyber warfare technology. But the fact is that although groups like Human Rights Watch argue that we should try to ban what they call killer robots, and they see drones as a kind of avatar of the future. Drones are not robots, of course, but they will become robots in 15 years' time when they become fully autonomous and don't require pilots with a joystick. That is going to be the end result. No one is suggesting that they are going to bring war to an end, or could do. That's the first point I would make. Second point I would say is that this is a further development of something which has long been happening, which is the reduction of war's human space. But the human element gets smaller and smaller, particularly when it comes to physical labor. Now, we will still have people out in the field, the grunts, as the Americans like to call them, who will be doing the physical things. And women will be joining them in combat after 2016, as you know, and I'll come to that point in a moment. But the point is that war has become more and more cerebral in the last 100 years. And this is the direction in which we are going. That to be a warrior in the 21st century is to essentially be somebody behind a screen, whether it's a cyber screen, a cyber warrior, or what the Americans call cubicle warriors, drone pilots, analytical warriors, people whose job is to process data, people who have 3 particular attributes which are now required of warfare in the 21st century compared with, say, 100 years ago. Mental agility, communication skills, and multitasking. A particular generation. And most drone pilots in the United States are between the ages of 19 and 21. Precisely the generation that is very good at these particular things. But a generation that has difficulty coping with stress, a generation that does get traumatized by what they see on their screens, and a generation that may not be able to cope with stress as much as the ideal age for coping with stress on a battlefield, which is still around 23. A third point that I want to make is what is the commitment and the engagement with war? Because we talk about the dissociation of sensibility, that in essence we're worried that war is becoming more and more like a video game. There are people who now spend 80 hours a week playing video games. Many of them are the generation of the drone pilots. Some of them are the drone pilots themselves. There was a virus that got into the American drone system last year, which for a moment people thought might have been placed there by Al-Qaeda or by Russia or by China. In the end, it was discovered that, in fact, it was the fact that they were playing games at the same time that they were sometimes flying the drones. The virus had jumped from one system to the other. The dissociation of sensibility, very different from distance. We were very worried in the late 19th and 20th centuries that if you're behind a machine gun or behind an artillery pieces, you're lobbing or mortar bombs or whatever it might be miles away. Or if you are 35,000 feet up bombing a German or Japanese city in the 1940s, to what extent did you appreciate the damage that was actually being caused? This was the problem of distance, physical distance. This problem is a different one. It's about dissociation. not actually knowing what you're doing. And this is of great concern to the American military, and I imagine to the British military as well. There was an article in The Economist in November 2012 saying our soldiers must now be quarantined against trauma, since trauma is now the biggest reason why people are hospitalized. Suicide rates now are going at 14 a week in the United States military. This is a concern that human beings are having more and more difficulty coping with war. So the idea is that if they're dissociated from what they see on a screen, then that might be the best way of doing it. We're talking about empathy, essentially. Is it possible to empathize with the enemy that you are watching all the time on the screen and that you're about to vaporize at some point? And the main point about empathy is it's a rewiring problem. It's a neural problem. It's a patterning problem in our brains. Empathy is in the prefrontal cortex. If you have to, and there's been a 3,000% increase in the amount of information that is now processed as a result of video streaming from drones, and it gets more and more demanding every week as the information continues to accrue. At what point, in order to process the information, do you have to switch off that part of the brain, which is the part of the brain where you empathize? Basically, it's a bandwidth problem. You have to go broadband. And there are only two ways you can go broadband. One is by putting microchips in brains. We do that for paraplegics. That enables them to actually being able to move a cursor around without the use of their hands. We do it with blind people, about 15,000 people in the United States who can now see as a result of microchips in their brains. We don't do it with drone pilots because of the side effects. You only put microchips in brains if there is a real physical problem that you want to address, and there's a benefit that emerges from it, whatever the side effects may be. And the other is just taking drugs to boost concentration. And the drug, of course, of use is Ritalin. 20% of scientists, Nature magazine worked out as a result of a poll a couple of years ago, now take Ritalin voluntarily to keep up with the amount of information that is appearing every week in the magazines and on their screens. So I think this is, the rewiring of our brains is something which is quite new in war. And the rewiring is something that is of interest to Americans, to the American military. They're worried about concentration. Because if you're watching a screen for 8 or 12 hours a day, you begin to lose concentration. And they're monitoring concentration levels through brain scanning now. They can switch drone pilots off, if necessary, when they realize that they're losing their concentration. Susan Greenfield at Oxford, the neuroscientist, has written about this at some length. She's very concerned about these issues, something we might want to have a look at, because this is new in war. This is not the interface of the human being and technology. This is the integration of the human being into technology and the integration of technology into the human being. This is something which is new. Fourth point, are they warriors? Are drone pilots warriors? You can now get a medal for being a drone pilot. It's called the Distinguished Warfare Medal in the United States. It actually is more prestigious than getting the Bronze Star or the Purple Heart. And this upsets a lot of American infantrymen who feel that those two medals, which they are entitled to win through good service on the battlefield, this is a matter of some concern. But it seems that we are tenaciously holding to the idea or the myth of the warrior as something that we can't let go of. Not least because, of course, with the warrior comes the warrior ethos. This is where we come to the morality and the ethics, not necessarily the law. But let's ask some other questions. Why shouldn't civilians be drone pilots? Indeed, a Predator commander in the United States last year said civilians could do the job just as well. Why do you actually have to wear a uniform to be a drone pilot? There are examples in history, we can go into this if you like, of where civilians have actually performed military functions. And women. One of the fascinating things about the future character of war is going to be the use of women in combat. But you won't find women drone pilots, very few. The actual people who have the joysticks, as opposed to the analysts. And you don't find many women cyber warriors. It's an interesting phenomenon because, of course, the generation that are drone pilots are the generation of video game players who tend to be adolescent males. Just as the number of people who hack into computers from the age of 11 or even earlier these days, who the US military deliberately looks for now to be the cyber warriors of the future. Many of them with, of course, criminal records because of their hacking activities, but not for gain, but just out of curiosity or to win kudos, are mostly male adolescents, not women. So when it comes to the feminization of war or the masculinization of women, these are issues that divide the community when it comes to whether women should do combat or not. Nobody needs to talk about women here because this is still a male world. And how long that will remain the case is in itself quite interesting. Last point, what's happening to war then? I think that war is alive and well. It is once again showing its protean nature, its resilience, its ability to reinvent itself for the 21st century. I think it may be becoming a little bit smaller. Some of you may know that wonderful line in Sunset Boulevard where Joe Gillis, the journalist, says to Norma Desmond, "You used to be in pictures, you used to be big." And she says, "I am big, it's the movies that got small." In essence, I think war is perhaps getting smaller in the way that perhaps 50 years ago we would have understood it in terms of involving an entire community and producing national heroes and producing heroic stereotypes or real heroic personalities. And I think this is beginning to be touched upon by writers. I just wanted to mention two writers in conclusion. John Updike, one of his last novels, was about a putative war between the United States and China in 2020, where he looks back, or his hero looks back, at what he calls a diminished world. A war that had been brought to us by young men and women, highly trained, doing 3G computer graphics in bunkers, never actually emerging to understand the real world. Or Don DeLillo's short story, Human Moments in World War III, written a long time ago, in 1982, long before, well, drones have been with us since the 60s, but long before drones became part of the popular psyche, writing about a young guy called Volmer in a space orbital mission, essentially a drone pilot, zapping anything that moves on the planet, wearing his carpet slippers at the remote console, wearing whatever costume he wants because he doesn't have to wear uniform, and at one point saying in the story to his commanding officer, "You know, I'm actually quite happy," and his commanding officer saying, "Listen, happiness is not one of the mission parameters. Emotions are not the mission parameters." It's what Clausewitz said is what war might become one day, although he had difficulty imagining it. War by algebra. War without human emotion. War without human involvement. Now, we're a long way away from that, and drone pilots are involved emotionally, which is why many of them suffer as they do, and they make sacrifices. It's an extraordinary kind of life that you or I would be asked to leave, to spend 12 hours in the office, possibly killing people, and then having to go back to your wife and children. You try to live that life. That is a life of sacrifice, which they have to make. And that is why war still has this human dimension. But I want to end on this note, and it's the note that I try to develop in the book, which is essentially war has always been what Thucydides, the first military historian in the world, called the human thing. He refused to come up with any other definition for war. It's very generic, the human thing. It's what human beings do. But I think our humanity is beginning to change. We will be sharing the battle spaces of the future with robots, so that coexistence with machines is going to be a very important part, but we're not here to talk about robots today. We are talking about the integration of man and machine, not woman and machine, at this particular level. And that, I think, would, if Thucydides were alive today, make it very difficult for him to come up with this term, the human thing, unless we say that our humanity itself is changing, as Susan Greenfield suggests, as a result of changes in our neural patterning and things of this kind. And we're talking about post-humanity, the post-human age. This is the first sign of post-human war. And on that note, I will end.